The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and formal with a law firm's embossed logo staring back at me. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open, completely unprepared for what waited inside. The letter began with cold legal language that made my stomach drop, notice of intent to pursue legal action for unjust enrichment. My brother Ethan was suing me, claiming I had stolen money from our late father's estate using something called the doctrine of restitution. I read the words 3 times, each time feeling more disbelief than the last. According to his lawyer, I had wrongfully obtained substantial funds that rightfully belonged to him, and he demanded immediate repayment plus interest. The letter threatened formal court proceedings if I didn't respond within 14 days. I sat down heavily on my kitchen chair, the paper crumpling slightly in my grip. Ethan and I hadn't spoken properly in almost 2 years, not since Dad's funeral when he disappeared overseas without helping settle anything. Now he was back, armed with legal threats and accusations that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. This was war. I closed my eyes and let the memories flood back, all those years of watching Ethan manipulate everyone around him with practiced ease. Even as children, he had possessed an uncanny ability to twist situations in his favor. When he broke Mom's favorite vase at age 10, he somehow convinced our parents that I had done it. I took the punishment silently, already learning that fighting Ethan's version of reality was pointless. As teenagers, he borrowed my savings repeatedly, always promising to pay me back next week or next month. Those promises evaporated like morning fog, and I eventually stopped asking. When I got my first real job at 22, he called asking for money to start a business venture. I gave him $2,000 I could barely afford, believing his passionate promises about repaying me double within 6 months. That money vanished into whatever lifestyle he was funding at the time. Dad saw through Ethan's manipulations but felt powerless to change him. Mom made endless excuses, always believing his next promise would be different. I became the responsible one by default, the daughter who handled problems while Ethan floated through life expecting others to clean up his messes. Dad passed away suddenly from a heart attack 18 months ago, leaving behind a complicated web of business assets, property investments, and financial accounts that needed untangling. As executor of his estate, I spent countless hours with lawyers, accountants, and banks, methodically working through every detail while grieving the loss of the only parent who truly understood me. Ethan had been living in Thailand when Dad died, teaching English and supposedly finding himself for the 3rd time in 5 years. He showed up for the funeral wearing wrinkled clothes and borrowed shoes, cried dramatically at the service, then disappeared again 2 days later without offering to help with anything. He sent occasional messages asking vague questions about his inheritance but never followed through with actual paperwork or legal documentation. I handled everything alone, the business transfers, the property sales, the tax implications, the debt settlements. It took 14 months of exhausting work to finally settle the estate properly. During that entire time, Ethan contributed absolutely nothing except demands for updates and complaints that things were taking too long. Now, apparently, he had decided I had stolen from him. That evening, I went down to my basement storage and pulled out the boxes of old financial records I'd kept from Dad's estate. I searched through folders methodically, knowing there was something important I needed to find. Then I saw it, a manila envelope marked Ethan Investment Agreement 2019 in my own handwriting. Inside was a signed contract, witnessed and notarized, outlining a private business investment Ethan had begged me to make 3 years before Dad died. He'd been desperate then, chasing some cryptocurrency venture he swore would make us both rich. He needed $25,000 immediately and promised in writing to repay $30,000 within 2 years. I had used money from my own savings account, not Dad's estate, to fund his dream. The contract was crystal clear. This was a loan with specified terms, not a gift. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands steadier now. Ethan had conveniently forgotten this agreement existed, probably assuming I'd lost the paperwork in the chaos after Dad's death. He was wrong. I had kept everything organized and documented, because I'd learned long ago that nothing was permanent with Ethan except his capacity to rewrite history in his favor. Over the next 3 days, Ethan's calls and messages escalated from demanding to desperate. He left voicemails claiming I was destroying the family by refusing to do the right thing and return money that belonged to him. His texts grew increasingly unhinged, filled with legal jargon he clearly didn't understand and threats about consequences I would face. I didn't respond to any of it, letting his panic build in the silence. On the fourth day, he called from a blocked number, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "You can't just ignore this, Naomi. My lawyer says we have a strong case. You used Dad's money for your own benefit while I was overseas and couldn't protect my interests. That's textbook unjust enrichment." I finally spoke, my voice calm and cold. "Is that what your lawyer told you? Interesting." He seemed thrown by my composure. "I'm giving you one last chance to settle this privately before we go to court. Just admit what you did and pay me what's fair." I almost laughed. Fair. Ethan wouldn't recognize fair if it was legally notarized and handed to him. I hung up without another word, already knowing his lawsuit was only the opening move in whatever desperate scheme he'd constructed. The next morning, I sat across from Mr. Chen in his downtown office, the lawyer's letter spread out on his polished desk between us. Henry Chen had been Dad's attorney for 20 years and knew our family history better than most therapists. He read Ethan's legal threat carefully, his expression growing more skeptical with each paragraph. Finally, he set the papers down and looked at me over his reading glasses. "This restitution claim is weak at best, Naomi. He'd need to prove you actually received money improperly from the estate, which you didn't. You were the executor, you handled everything by the book, and I have all the documentation proving proper distribution." I nodded, then slid the investment agreement across the desk. "But I have something stronger." Mr. Chen's eyebrows rose as he examined the contract, his lips curving into something resembling a smile. "This is ironclad. Signed, witnessed, notarized. He borrowed $25,000 from you personally, promising repayment with interest. He never paid." He looked up at me with newfound respect. "You could file a contract claim against him right now." I met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly what I want to do." That afternoon, I spread out every piece of financial evidence I'd collected over the years across my dining room table. Bank statements from 2019 showed the exact wire transfer of $25,000 from my personal account to Ethan's on March 15th. I found email exchanges where he'd thanked me profusely, calling me his amazing sister and promising this investment would change both our lives forever. There were text messages from months later where he'd asked for just a little more time to make the repayment, claiming his cryptocurrency venture was about to explode. I discovered receipts from 2 years ago when I'd loaned him another $3,000 for what he called an emergency that turned out to be funding his girlfriend's birthday trip to Bali. He'd promised to repay that money too, of course. The promises were always sincere in the moment, always heartfelt and believable, always forgotten by the following month. I photographed everything, organized it chronologically, and created a detailed spreadsheet tracking every dollar I'd given him over the past decade. The total came to $39,000, none of it ever repaid. Ethan thought he was attacking me. He'd actually just walked into a trap of his own making. Mr. Chen worked quickly, filing my contract claim against Ethan before his lawyer could officially file the restitution claim against me. It was a strategic move that shifted the entire battlefield onto my terms. In legal proceedings, filing first often meant controlling the narrative, choosing the jurisdiction, and setting the timeline. My claim was straightforward and devastating. Ethan had borrowed $25,000 under signed contract, promised repayment with interest, and had defaulted completely. I was seeking the full $30,000 he owed under the original agreement, plus the additional $14,000 he'd borrowed separately over the years, plus interest on all of it, plus my legal fees. The total came to just over $52,000. Mr. Chen sent me a copy of the filed documents with a brief message. Now we wait for his response. This will be interesting. I knew Ethan would be furious when he received the papers. He'd expected me to cower under his legal threats, to offer some settlement out of fear or guilt. Instead, I'd countered with documented proof of his debts, turning his attack into his own liability. Sometimes the best defense wasn't defending at all. Sometimes it was attacking first with truth. Ethan's response came faster than expected. He called screaming into the phone before I'd even finished my morning coffee, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. "You actually sued me? Your own brother? Are you insane?" I sipped my coffee calmly, letting him exhaust himself with fury. That contract is bullshit. I never agreed to those terms. You can't just make up documents and expect a judge to believe you. I waited for silence, then spoke quietly. The contract is signed by you, Ethan, witnessed by Sarah Morrison and notarized by a licensed notary public. The signature matches your driver's license, your passport, and every other legal document you've ever signed. But please, explain to the judge how I somehow forged your signature in front of 2 witnesses. He went silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from rage to something closer to panic. This isn't over, Naomi. My lawyer says we can still prove you manipulated me into signing that. You took advantage of my desperate situation. I'm still going to win this. But I could hear the fear underneath his bravado now. He was realizing he'd underestimated me completely, and that realization was terrifying him. Within days, the family grapevine exploded with gossip and judgment. Aunt Margaret called, her voice dripping with disapproval, lecturing me about dragging family matters into court. Uncle Robert sent a long email about forgiveness and moving past grudges. Mom's sister Linda actually had the audacity to suggest I was being vindictive and cruel to poor Ethan, who was just trying to get what's rightfully his. I listened to Margaret's lecture without defending myself, deleted Robert's email without reading past the first paragraph, and blocked Linda's number entirely. But not everyone took Ethan's side. Dad's younger brother, Uncle James, called me privately one evening. Your father told me years ago that Ethan had been taking money from him, he said quietly. He was too proud to confront him directly, but he kept records. I think you should know there might be more you haven't discovered yet. That conversation led me to Dad's old accountant, a meticulous man named Richard Torres who'd handled Dad's business finances for 15 years. I'd be happy to meet with you, Richard said when I called. There are things about your brother's financial relationship with your father that you need to see. Richard's office was small and cluttered with filing cabinets that seemed to hold decades of financial secrets. He pulled out a thick folder marked with Dad's name and spread documents across his desk with practiced efficiency. Your father started noticing discrepancies about 4 years ago, Richard explained, pointing to highlighted entries in banking statements. Small withdrawals at first, 500 here, 800 there, always from accounts Ethan had access to as an authorized user. The pattern became clear as Richard walked me through the timeline. Ethan had been systematically taking money from Dad's business accounts, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger automatic alerts. Over 3 years, he'd siphoned nearly $18,000, probably assuming Dad was too old or too trusting to notice. Your father knew, Richard said quietly. He documented everything but never confronted Ethan. I think he was hoping Ethan would stop on his own, maybe even pay it back someday. He was protecting your mother from the truth. I felt anger and sadness wash over me in equal measure. Dad had known, had suffered this betrayal silently, and had still left Ethan a portion of the estate in his will. That generosity felt almost heartbreaking now. 2 weeks after my contract claim was filed, Ethan's lawyer submitted new evidence to the court, a document supposedly proving I owed Ethan money from a separate business transaction. The paperwork looked official at first glance, complete with signatures and dates that aligned with the timeline of Dad's estate settlement. But something felt wrong the moment I examined it closely. The signature attributed to me was slightly off. The capital letters formed differently than I actually wrote them. The date format was wrong too. I always wrote dates as month, day, year, but this document showed day, month, year, European style. Most damning of all, the document referenced a business meeting that supposedly took place on July 15, 2022, a date when I'd actually been in the hospital recovering from emergency appendix surgery, with medical records to prove it. I called Mr. Chen immediately, my voice shaking with anger. He forged this. Ethan actually submitted a forged document to the court. Mr. Chen was silent for a moment, then spoke carefully. Are you absolutely certain? I sent him photographs of my medical records, my actual signature samples, and a detailed breakdown of every inconsistency. I'm certain. And I want him prosecuted for fraud. Instead of immediately exposing the forgery, Mr. Chen advised a different strategy, strategic silence. Let him think it's working, he explained. Let him believe you haven't noticed or don't have the resources to fight it. His confidence will make him careless. So I stopped responding to Ethan's messages and calls entirely. I didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't engage at all. The silence seemed to unnerve him more than any argument could have. His messages grew increasingly frantic, shifting from aggressive demands to confused questions. Why aren't you responding? Are you talking to your lawyer? What are you planning? I didn't answer. Days passed, then weeks. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Ethan was becoming paranoid, convinced I was plotting something he couldn't see. He was right. I was letting him destroy himself with his own desperation and lies while I quietly gathered every piece of evidence that would demolish his case. Sometimes the most powerful move in a legal battle wasn't dramatic action. Sometimes it was calculated, patient silence that let your opponent's fear do the damage for you. I waited, watched, and prepared for the perfect moment to strike. While I maintained my silence, Ethan's life began crumbling in spectacular fashion. Through the family grapevine, I learned his cryptocurrency business had collapsed entirely, losing money for every investor foolish enough to trust him. His long-term girlfriend, finally seeing through his manipulations, had left him and moved back to her home country. Debt collectors were apparently calling him daily, chasing down credit card bills and personal loans he'd taken out with promises he couldn't keep. Uncle James called with an update. He's been asking family members for money, claiming he needs it for legal fees to fight your lawsuit. Most people are refusing now. Word has gotten around about why you're actually suing him. I felt no satisfaction in Ethan's downward spiral, just a hollow sadness that it had come to this. He could have avoided all of it by simply being honest, by paying back what he owed, by treating family relationships as something more valuable than financial opportunities to exploit. But Ethan had never learned that lesson, and now reality was presenting him with the bill for decades of manipulation and entitlement. His desperation was becoming dangerous though. Desperate people made reckless decisions, and I knew the mediation hearing was approaching fast. The mediation was scheduled for a Friday morning in a neutral conference room downtown. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed professionally, carrying a leather folder containing organized evidence Mr. Chen and I had prepared. Ethan showed up 10 minutes late, looking disheveled and angry, his lawyer trailing behind wearing an expression of someone who regretted taking this case. The mediator, a retired judge named Patricia Holloway, explained the process with practiced neutrality. Ethan immediately launched into his prepared statement, voice rising with theatrical indignation. He claimed I'd manipulated him throughout our lives, taken advantage of his trusting nature, and stolen money from Dad's estate while he was overseas and vulnerable. He painted himself as the victim of my calculated greed. I listened without expression, taking occasional notes. When he finally finished his performance, Judge Holloway turned to me. Ms. Naomi, would you like to respond? I opened my leather folder calmly. I'd prefer to present evidence. What happened next was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. I laid out the signed investment contract first, sliding it across the table to the mediator. Then the bank transfer records. Then the email exchanges where Ethan thanked me and promised repayment. Then the text messages. Then the evidence of additional loans. Finally, I presented Richard's documentation of Ethan's theft from Dad's accounts. The mediator's expression shifted from neutral to increasingly troubled as she examined each piece of evidence. Ethan's face drained of color. Judge Holloway studied the investment contract for what felt like an eternity, her finger tracing the signatures and notary seal. She looked up at Ethan's lawyer with barely concealed skepticism. Counselor, was your client aware this contract existed before filing his restitution claim? Ethan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. My client informed me that any previous financial arrangements with his sister were informal family matters, not legally binding contracts. I couldn't help myself. So he lied to you. The lawyer's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Judge Holloway continued examining the evidence methodically, the bank statement showing my personal account transfer, the email trail proving Ethan's acknowledgement of the debt, the text messages where he'd asked for extensions. Each piece built an unshakable narrative that Ethan had borrowed substantial money, promised repayment, and defaulted completely. When she reached Richard's documentation of Ethan's unauthorized withdrawals from Dad's business accounts, Her expression hardened further. Mr. Ethan, these bank records suggest you were taking money from your father's accounts without authorization. Were you aware your father had documented this? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came out. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, a clear signal to remain silent. The mediation room felt thick with tension as Judge Holloway made notes on her legal pad, the only sound the scratch of her pen against paper. Ethan's lawyer attempted to salvage the situation with a pivot that was both desperate and transparent. Even if these loans existed as documented, my client's restitution claim addresses a separate issue, the improper distribution of estate assets that Ms. Naomi controlled as executor. Mr. Chen responded before I could, his voice sharp with professional disdain. The estate distribution was handled entirely through proper legal channels, approved by probate court, and audited by independent accountants. Every dollar was accounted for and distributed according to the will. Your client received exactly what the will specified, 40% of liquid assets after debts and expenses. I have the court-approved distribution order right here. He slid the official document across the table. Ethan's lawyer reviewed it briefly, his expression showing he was realizing how weak his position had become. He tried another angle. My client was overseas during the estate settlement and couldn't properly review. Your client was sent copies of all relevant documents via email and certified mail, Mr. Chen interrupted. He signed acknowledgement of receipt. He had 90 days to raise objections through proper legal channels. He raised none. That window has closed. I watched Ethan's lawyer deflate slightly, finally understanding he'd been given incomplete information by a desperate client and built a case on sand. Sitting in that mediation room, I suddenly remembered a conversation with Dad from years ago. We'd been sitting on his back porch one evening, watching the sunset, and he'd turned to me with unusual seriousness. Your brother will destroy anything he can't control, Naomi. It's not about money with him. It's about power. He needs to feel like he's winning, even if winning means everyone else loses. I'd asked Dad why he didn't cut Ethan off completely, stop enabling his behavior. Dad had looked sad then, older than his years. Because he's my son, and I keep hoping something will change. But you need to protect yourself from him. Document everything. Trust nothing he promises. When I'm gone, he'll probably come after you, because you're the one who'll have what he wants, stability, success, respect. Don't let him take that from you. I'd assured Dad I could handle Ethan, maybe not fully believing it at the time. But Dad had known. He'd seen this confrontation coming years before it happened and had tried to prepare me. Now, sitting across from my brother as his lies unraveled in real time, I understood what Dad had meant. This wasn't about money for Ethan. It was about control, about resentment, about his fundamental inability to accept that I'd built something he couldn't manipulate or destroy. Dad's warning echoed in my mind. Document everything. Trust nothing he promises. The actual court hearing came 6 weeks later, after mediation failed to produce any settlement. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined from television, and sparsely filled with just a few observers. The judge, Honorable Michael Brennan, was a stern-looking man in his 60s with a reputation for intolerance toward frivolous lawsuits. Ethan's lawyer presented his restitution claim first, trying to suggest I'd somehow mishandled estate funds or taken more than my share as executor. Judge Brennan listened without expression, occasionally making notes. When Ethan's lawyer finished, the judge looked up with barely concealed impatience. Counselor, I've reviewed the probate records for this estate. Everything was approved by Judge Martinez in probate court after full audit. Are you suggesting Judge Martinez made an error in her approval, or are you claiming fraud in the distribution? Ethan's lawyer hesitated, realizing the trap. No, Your Honor. We're simply suggesting that certain arrangements between the siblings should be re-examined in light of what? Judge Brennan interrupted. In light of your client's documented debts to his sister, in light of his unauthorized withdrawals from his father's accounts. Help me understand your legal theory here. The courtroom felt cold as Ethan's lawyer struggled to respond. Finally, Judge Brennan spoke the words I'd been waiting to hear. This restitution claim is baseless and appears to be filed in bad faith. Motion dismissed. Then it was Mr. Chen's turn to present my contract claim, And he did so with devastating efficiency. He walked Judge Brennan through the signed investment agreement, the bank transfers proving I'd funded Ethan's cryptocurrency venture, and the emails where Ethan had acknowledged his debt and promised repayment. He presented the additional loans I'd made to Ethan over the years, each one documented with bank records and text message confirmations. He showed the timeline of Ethan's promises and excuses, stretching across years of broken commitments. Finally, he presented Richard's evidence of Ethan's theft from Dad's business accounts, establishing a pattern of financial irresponsibility and dishonesty. Judge Brennan examined each piece of evidence carefully, asking occasional clarifying questions that Mr. Chen answered precisely. When the presentation concluded, the judge turned to Ethan directly. "Mr. Ethan, do you dispute the signature on this investment contract?" Ethan looked at his lawyer, who nodded reluctantly. "No, Your Honor." "Do you dispute that you received $25,000 from your sister on March 15, 2019? "No, Your Honor." "Do you dispute that you promised to repay this money and failed to do so?" Silence. Then quietly, "No, Your Honor." Judge Brennan made notes, then delivered his ruling. Judgment for the plaintiff. "Mr. Ethan, you are ordered to repay the full loan amount of $25,000, plus interest at the statutory rate, plus the additional documented loans totaling $14,000, plus the plaintiff's legal fees. Total judgment, $52,300. After the hearing, Ethan waited for me outside the courthouse, his face a mixture of desperation and anger. His lawyer had already left, probably relieved to be done with such a difficult client. "Naomi, please, can we just talk for a minute?" I stopped, maintaining distance between us. "There's nothing to talk about, Ethan," the judge ruled. "I don't have $52,000. You know I don't. This judgment will destroy me financially." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw someone who still didn't understand that his own actions had led to this moment. "You destroyed yourself, Ethan. I just documented it." He switched tactics, his voice becoming softer, more pleading. "I was misguided, okay? I was under pressure from debt collectors and made bad decisions. I shouldn't have sued you. I shouldn't have forged that document. I'm sorry." The apology sounded rehearsed, calculated to manipulate rather than express genuine remorse. "You're sorry you lost, not sorry for what you did." "That's not fair. I'm your brother. Doesn't that mean anything?" I felt tired suddenly, exhausted by years of his manipulation and lies. Being my brother meant something when we were kids. You destroyed that meaning yourself, piece by piece, lie by lie, over 30 years. This is just the final accounting. The financial consequences hit Ethan faster than even I had anticipated. Within days of the judgment, the court ordered his bank accounts garnished to begin repayment. His credit cards were frozen by creditors who saw the judgment as evidence of his inability to repay debts. The small apartment he'd been renting was suddenly unaffordable, and he had to move into a friend's spare room. I heard through family that he tried to find work, but his damaged reputation in our small business community made employers wary. The cryptocurrency venture that had consumed his time and other people's money was completely defunct, leaving investors angry and threatening their own legal action. Even the family members who'd initially defended him began quietly distancing themselves as more details of his financial manipulation emerged. Aunt Margaret, who'd lectured me about family loyalty, apparently stopped returning his calls after he asked to borrow money. Uncle Robert, who'd preached forgiveness, changed his tune after learning about the forged document. Mom's sister Linda, who'd called me vindictive, actually called to apologize after hearing the full story from other relatives. The social consequences seemed to hurt Ethan more than the financial ones. He'd always relied on his charm and ability to rewrite his own narrative, but this time the evidence was too clear, too documented, too public for manipulation to work. With the legal war finally behind me, I focused on reclaiming the peace Ethan had disrupted. I threw myself into my work, a marketing consulting business I'd built over 10 years into something successful and stable. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the stressful months of legal preparation. I started therapy to process the complicated grief of losing my father and the painful reality of my relationship with my brother. Slowly, The knot of tension I'd carried in my chest began to loosen. I realized I'd been holding my breath for years, waiting for Ethan's next crisis or manipulation, always bracing for the emotional damage he would inevitably cause. Now, with legal boundaries firmly established and enforced, I could finally exhale. I redecorated my home office, creating a space that felt inspiring rather than oppressive. I took weekend trips to the mountains, remembering how to enjoy solitude without constant anxiety. I even started dating again, something I'd avoided during the worst of the family drama. The most unexpected gift of the entire ordeal was clarity. I finally understood that I wasn't responsible for fixing Ethan, saving him from himself, or protecting the family from the truth of his character. Those had never been my responsibilities, though I'd carried them for decades anyway. Letting go of that burden felt like learning to breathe properly for the first time. 3 months after the judgment, I heard from Uncle James that Ethan had left the country again. Apparently, unable to pay what he owed, facing garnished wages and frozen accounts, with burned bridges everywhere he turned, he'd bought a one-way ticket to Southeast Asia. It was the same escape pattern he'd followed years ago. When life got too difficult or consequences too real, Ethan simply fled to somewhere he could reinvent himself and start fresh. Part of me wondered if he'd ever pay back the judgment, or if the $52,000 would remain a theoretical debt that followed him on paper but never materialized in reality. Mr. Chen had warned me that collecting judgments could be difficult, especially from someone with limited assets and a willingness to leave the country. But I realized the money had never been the point. The lawsuit wasn't about recovering funds I'd written off years ago. It was about establishing truth in a legal record that couldn't be manipulated or rewritten by Ethan's charm and lies. It was about drawing a boundary and enforcing it with consequences. It was about refusing to be a victim of his manipulation anymore. Whether Ethan ever paid a single dollar of the judgment mattered less than the fact that a judge had heard the evidence and validated what I'd known all along. I wasn't the villain in this story. Ethan was. 6 months after everything ended, I found myself standing at the old property Dad had owned on the edge of town. The land had been sold as part of the estate settlement, but the new owners hadn't developed it yet, and I'd gotten permission to walk the grounds one last time. I stood where Dad's workshop used to be, remembering afternoons spent watching him restore old furniture with patient hands. This was where he'd told me about Ethan's pattern of destruction, where he'd warned me to protect myself, where he'd shown me that love didn't mean accepting abuse. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple Dad would have appreciated. I thought about everything that had happened, the lawsuit, the betrayal, the evidence, the judgment. I thought about the family members who'd chosen sides and the relationships that had survived or crumbled under pressure. Mostly, I thought about the fact that I'd won not because I was cruel or vindictive, but because I'd simply documented the truth and refused to let lies stand unchallenged. I whispered the words I'd wanted to say to Ethan in court but hadn't. You tried to bury me with the law. You forgot I read the fine print first. Then I walked away from that property, away from the ghost of family dynamics that had held me captive for too long, and toward a future I was finally free to build on my own terms. Stronger, wiser, and finally, completely free.